Informative and especially entertaining presentation. Our next presenter is Moran. He is the director of the Deregulation Unit at the Institute of Public Affairs. An economist, he was previously a senior Australian government official with responsibilities that included regulation review and energy policy. He is one of Australia's best-known commentators on the energy industry, and over the past 10 years has published more than 30 major papers and addresses covering specific aspects of the industry. In addition to editing a recent book, Climate Change, The Facts, he has authored 4 books, including 3 on environmental economics, and published dozens of articles and submissions on privatization, energy, and other economic policy matters. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Alan Moran.
Thanks, Jim. I want to talk a bit about the ugly intersection of not only politics and science, but politics, science, and economics, because essentially the sorts of issues raised by scientists, the warmists, if you like, are that the world is getting a lot warmer, or maybe it's not getting a lot warmer, but certainly it might well be getting a lot warmer, and it's worth taking the insurance just in case. And then the next leg of that, or string of that bow, is that, and by the way, the insurance isn't very dear. Essentially, we can put in some measures of carbon tax or whatever, and it won't cost us very much. So it makes a lot of sense to do so. Well, you know, I'm just really here to debunk that myth. And I'll start off by saying that the sorts of greenhouse gas emission levels the ICCC estimates are required to limit temperature increases to about 2 degrees centigrade. We're looking at world emissions of CO2 and other gases by reducing by about a quarter from the current levels. And this is a major task for the developed nations, and you can see there Australia, the US, they've got to get down to about 3.5 tons per capita from 20-ish tons per capita. But you can also see the ominous aspect of it, and clearly a major aspect of Copenhagen is that China is already up above, well above the level it's got to get down to, and it's only got a quarter of its people in the developed part of the world so far. So the impossibility of the developing countries getting there is quite tangible, as well as the impossibility of the developed countries reducing, which I'll come back to. If we forcing reductions in these emissions, and we've gone through this, or we're going through it in politics, really there's 2 broad ways of doing that, and one is quantitative controls, another is price-based measures. They're the 2 sorts, and there's a plethora of different approaches within those that can be followed. But they all amount to the same thing. You have to reduce, you have to force the reduction. If we look in terms of the quantitative controls, well, we've got a whole stack of those already. We've got them on cars, cafe, we've got them on buildings, even things like showers, domestic appliances. We've got these various requirements to utilize energy and emission and bring down emission levels. In Australia, one of the biggest ones we have is what we call a 5-star housing requirement. So new houses have to be built in such a way to be energy efficient, more energy efficient than presumably than the buyers would want, and it's estimated to cost about $7,000 to $15,000 per new house. The second aspect on there, the renewable energy requirements. Almost every country's got some form of these. To our great shame, we've passed unanimously by the Parliament. We have a 20% renewable requirement in Australia, which means by 2020, 20% of electricity has to be generated by renewable or eligible renewable forms. There's no question about anyone building a dam or anything like that, anything that might actually make sense economically. These have got to be by the exotic renewable forms. And the cheapest one of those exotic forms is wind. And wind in Australia, in the Australian context, is about 3 times the price of coal-based electricity, 3 times and more, because it's obviously intrinsically unreliable. And also, because it's dispersed, you need to spend an awful lot more money in terms of transmission, etc. We had a well-publicised report in Australia, largely financed by the Greens, but also part of the ALP, the Moran Institute. It was the ALP think tank was associated with it as well. It was called Zero Carbon Emissions. Basically, that said that, you know, for an investment for $370 billion, and you can multiply that by 20-fold if you're talking in American terms, we could eradicate virtually carbon emissions from stationary sources. Carbon emissions from stationary sources about half the total. And they said, of course, they argued that renewables will be competitive. Well, of course, if they will be competitive, that's great, and they'll displace the existing ones, just like the motor car displays the horse and carriage. But nobody really believes that in the end. They also argued in this report that not only are we sort of trending in this direction, but will actually be more employment. They use twice as many people to produce the energy. There's sort of they totally rejects these kind of old-fashioned notions that, you know, if we conserve on resources and use less labour, we're going to be all better off. They totally throw that sort of economics out the window, and they applaud the latest poster child, of course, which is Spain. Spain, at horrendous cost, has achieved double-digit market share for renewables in its electricity. But they don't really show any curiosity about whether this may have been part of the reason why Spain is a sort of a basket case in European economies at the present time. Nor the data, which is really quite readily available to demonstrate in Spain's case that the Spanish wind farms, for every job that they created, the higher cost involved at 2.2 jobs lost. And of course, Spain's unemployment rate is about 20% at the present time. The third sort of quantitative restraint, and this starts merging into the price-based control, is the cap and trade, and that allocates or sells aggregate reductions which become tradable rights, meaning that the price emerges. Usually, and certainly the intent in Australia was to give free allocation to certain import competing activities and energy-intensive exports, and sunk investments, which of course would be undermined. They'd have to pay a very high price, obviously, especially the coal-based generators. Would be taxed, and so they would be given, at least in the interim, some quantitative restrictions which they may be able to sell. The cap and trade really, as I say, starts to merge into the more price-based controls, and that's carbon tax is of course the flavour du jour on that. But the whole point about the price-based control, hardly anybody really sees these as pure things. Marius Kloppers, for example, it was mentioned already, he said it was a great idea to have this carbon price, but not for us, not for BHP, not for our exports, not for our import competing stuff. We just have it on some aspects which coincidentally don't really affect BHP. The other aspect of the price-based control is the flip side, and that's the pure subsidy. I'll come back to that later. The subsidies in Australia, we spend about $3 billion a year, which is taxpayers' money, to subsidise low emissions, etc. And that's from the budget. This kind of graph, McKinsey have made a lot of money doing this. They've gone through all countries in the world and said, well, look, how much could we do? How much would it cost to abate greenhouse gases in various ways? And those on the left, which include like residential electronics and Tillys and residue management and full hybrid cars, all of these you'd actually make money. There'd be a negative cost, they say, per tonne of CO2. And those on the right would be progressively higher costs. In other words, if you went to pasture land or forestation, it cost you about $10 per tonne of CO2. You're getting it to gas plant retrofits would cost like $60 per tonne of CO2. That's in euros, sorry, not dollars. But the same sort of graph has been reproduced. There's one for Australia, there's one for the US, there's one for a whole lot of countries. And it really sees that there's a considerable scope for low or negative cost measures that would reduce emissions. And it's quite seductive, and indeed it's been seductive even parts of the Liberal Party in Australia, which say, okay, we can just pick a few winners there, and that way we can reduce the emissions. It won't cost us anything. We might even make some money. The problem with it all is that, you know, that's a kind of mirage that central planners often have. You know, if only we can pick the right work, pick the right products, pick everything else, we, being the government or whoever, then, you know, we'll have this nirvana. But really, the chart is based on quite narrow experiences and lab testing. And in practice, the conditions are so varying that the costs are really meaningless. And then some of the pitfalls we've actually experienced in Australia with the subsidised retrofit of ceiling insulation, which in the McKinsey case, that was estimated to give us a net gain of about 30 euros per tonne in the European approach, if we'd have gone that route. The Australian scheme was a bit more hard-nosed than that, and they estimated the cost would save 50 million tonnes of CO2 at a total cost of $2.5 billion, or in other words, $50 per tonne of CO2, which is quite a high price to pay for reductions, but it's not massively out of the sort of equation which is being used. But, and of course, and the Australians will all know this, the over-hasty and now discontinued rollout led to 4 deaths of contractors, hundreds of house fires, and the estimated 50-tonne saving is now considered more like 20 tonnes. So the cost isn't $50 per tonne, it's more like $200 per tonne, plus the disasters in terms of tragic deaths, etc. Hence, for that sort of reason, there are the advantages which a couple of people mentioned already, Corey mentioned, that there is an advantage of price-based measures, either a carbon tax or a hybrid cap and trade, because they do allow greater scope for market mechanisms to operate and search out the cheapest ways. But that said, there's no jurisdiction with a pure market operation. The EU's cap and trade has also got considerable regulation on vehicles and for wind. And there's no suggestion by anyone that, you know, we'll have this cap and trade or this carbon tax. We're going to dismantle all the other controls. Absolutely no question at all. Not in Australia, not in Europe, not in the US or anywhere else. The various measures in place in the EU have in fact led to a price, a fairly stable, although it has been irregular, but a price of 10 to 15 euros per tonne of CO2, and that's the price at which it's been trading at for over a year. The rights have been created, and as many of Corey, for instance, has said, that, you know, the rights are created. It is actually difficult to dismantle those rights, and people are buying and selling them. And of course, that price increase has contributed, there's been other factors as well, has contributed to actually a reduction in emissions in the EU, about 10 or 11% since 1990. But one of the problems, of course, is that a lot of that reduction is caused by migration of activities out of the EU. And here is a particular vulnerability for Australia. We actually, because of that very high level of emissions that we have, it's partly because others are subcontracting their emissions. They buy aluminium, they buy various energy-intensive products from Australia, and therefore the Australian economy is making emissions which actually are used elsewhere. The actual kind of numbers that are involved in there, the US, for example, outsources about 11% of its emissions, mainly to developing countries. Japan about 18%, but the European countries between 20 and 50% of their emissions are outsourced. In other words, they're consumed inside, but are created elsewhere. I mentioned that the EU price had stayed fairly stable. This is the US contract price for CO2, and it's gone down, sinking to negligible levels, 10 cents, indicating that in the US there's very little market. The market is taking the view that there's very unlikely to be any cap and trade tax there. One of the interesting things about the US as well is that that kind of thing is backed up by this chart. The chart basically shows the planned new generators and capacity additions in the US. Interesting thing about the chart is that the first line, coal, shows maybe 30% of new energy sources are coal. In other words, and that's about the sort of level, the average level, the existing level in the US. In other words, US businesses are not taking face value the word of presidential candidate Obama, who said, who's made it very clear that if you actually invest, he won't be banning coal-based electricity, but if you invest in it, you're crazy because you're at considerable risk of losses because there'll be some punitive government action. So US basically is going ahead building new generators, carbon-based generators. Not so in Australia. The threats are far more seriously taken here. We've got coal supplies about 80% of electricity in Australia, and the threat of the carbon tax or carbon cap and trade or other punitive measures is taken so seriously that there's no significant coal-fired power station which has received financial commitments since 2002 in Australia. And that's in spite of the fact we've got the cheapest coal in the world, and we're actually running some risks in terms of shortage of power at the present time. No commercial firm could ever build a power station right now. So let's so that's the position where we are. But let's look at the economics of carbon reduction, because that is the other sort of side of the scissors of the scientific aspect. And the economics of the debate are twofold. Firstly, what are the estimated costs of warming should it take place? How much would it cost us if there is this kind of warming? And secondly, how much would it cost us to reduce the carbon dioxide said to be the cause of that warming, the emissions, on the scale required? Well, there's been surprisingly few number actually, but there's been about 10 or 12, 13 different studies looking at what the costs are of the warming level, a global warming level. It varies by country and by region, etc. What the cost would be of warmings of 1 degree to 2.5 to 3 degrees warming. The answer is, of these studies, of these 11 to 12 studies, they come to a conclusion that with a 3 degree centigrade warming, and of course Linson, Linson has suggested the maximum possible is 1 degree, and others have suggested really it's only half a degree centigrade, but with a 3 degree centigrade warming, the cost to economies globally are plus or minus 2.5% of GDP, world GDP. It's 2.5% of world GDP. They're the study. There is one outlying study, which is the Stern Review, which is a joke. The Stern Review basically says, even that says it's 12.5%. There's a cost of 12.5% of GDP. And it's a real outlier. It wasn't peer reviewed. Not that peer reviewed means much nowadays, but it certainly wasn't peer reviewed, and it was, and it's a total outlier in terms of other studies. Actually, not total outlier, because Garner has a very difficult to estimate what Garner's numbers are, but I think they're about 8, I guess. So basically, that's the cost of global warming if it takes place. Now you've got to bear in mind that's in the context of an underlying growth rate of economies. Well, by 2050, the cost, if we're losing 2.5 or gaining 2.5% of GDP, by 2050, in Australia, for example, income levels are about 75 or 80% higher than they are today. That's with business as usual. Of course, Australia's not particularly fast growing, and other countries are even higher. This is per capita. So per capita incomes are increasing over the next, say, 50 years by about 70 or 80%. If global warming is taking place, it may be shaving 2.5 percentage points off that. The other side, though, is what will it cost us to actually make these emission reductions? How much will it cost us? And in Australia's case, as you saw from the first graph, those emission reductions we've got to reduce it by 4/5 our carbon dioxide emissions. To do so, most economists would say, well, how much would the effective price be to do that? And there are lots of different prices. The estimates range from, well, an optimistic, some people say, well, if the carbon price was $30 per tonne, that might do it. And others are saying, well, no, it must be hundreds of dollars a tonne. I'll come back to some of those things. The ICCC, for example, in its the forecast, they're not scenarios, but they're putting the world tax at about $100 per tonne. But if it's $30 a tonne, that means we double the price of electricity in Australia. If it's hundreds of dollars a tonne, we're 7 or 8 or 9-fold increase in the price of electricity. The Australian Treasury has got many price estimates and a whole galaxy of different scenarios. Its initial price, it suggests, and this doesn't involve getting rid of the existing interventions, but initial price is $23 per tonne of CO2. That translates roughly into $30 a megawatt hour of electricity. Electricity costs about $30 or $40 a megawatt hour, depending where you are in Australia. So the Australian Treasury is saying, well, if we double it and keep maybe a little bit more as time goes by, that'll do the trick. We'll reduce it by 4/5, and this will cost only about 2 to 3% of GDP loss. Won't be very much. By 2050, we'll be 2 to 3% poorer than we would be, again with this business as usual of an increase of 70 or 80%. We'll hardly notice it, will we? Well, maybe not. But this is what Treasury's forecasts are. It's all based on technological forecasting. And they've got a whole lot. This is the 550 part per million scenario. But by 2050, they're projecting under this scenario that the non-hydro renewable, which means wind, plus coal, carbon capture and storage, which doesn't exist at the moment, plus some gas capture, these will be 70 or 80% or more of our energy. And yet, wind is surely, it comes to the end of its tether as a reliable source of electricity, and the others haven't even been discovered yet. So basically, Treasury's forecasts are simple guesses. They're basically bold technological assumptions coupled with some experiences of people's reactions to higher prices. But the only problem is that the sort of higher prices we're talking about are unprecedented. The only precedent we've got for the sorts of massive increase in prices in electricity and other energy is the oil crisis in the 1970s. Now, in retrospect, we actually steered through that crisis quite well. I mean, there was, a lot of economic disruption, etc. But, we replaced the oil, or the oil price increased fourfold. But it was increased by other carbon fuels. It was increased to some degree by nuclear, and it was increased by people finding non-Middle East or non-OPEC oil. None of those alternatives are available in the scenarios mentioned. We're ruling out all these other possibilities. So unless we have some presently unknown breakthrough, or conceivably if we move towards nuclear power, throttling back the fossil fuel use would really, it's not credible to say that this would simply mean 2 to 3% reduction in our GDP levels. Forecasting models, based on these projections, the projections that they use are relatively small changes experienced in supply and demand over relatively short periods. Now some say, well, let's face it, energy is only 5% of GDP. It's only 5% of GDP. How serious is that? How serious is it throttling back this energy? Well, food is only 10 or 11 or 12% of GDP. And most of that is value added. Most of it is value added. Pure food is probably only 1% of GDP. And yet if we throttle back the pure food as we're going to throttle back the pure energy, of course, there'll be mass starvations. Let me just look at some of the implications of the tax that's needed. Now, no economy could ever run on renewables, and even if it could, and even if the subsidy for renewables was only at the current level of subsidy, effective subsidy we have in Australia, which is probably the same in every other country, which is about $40 per tonne of CO2. Even if it was only that, you can see for Australia that $40 per tonne of CO2, if we had that for the whole, and we displace all our carbon, it would raise about $18 billion. That is $1,000 per year for every worker. Now, US research it was telling you to say, well, people are a bit resistant to this, so we went out and did our own research, which is really what this does. This is a quite large sample, 16,000 people. Asked them how much they'd be prepared to pay to abate greenhouse gases. Only 6% said they'd be prepared to pay over $1,000, which is what they'd be required to do even on the present scenarios. Only 6% said that, and of course, they probably wouldn't be prepared to pay it when asked to put their hands in their pockets. 35% actually said that under no circumstances would they pay anything. And it's these sorts of research, which we did, the IPA did it, but clearly the legal party have got far greater interest in knowing this than we have, and they would have been doing all those sorts of researches anyway. And they're sort of driving the polls and driving the decision to fire red, etc., and to move away from ostensibly supporting a greenhouse tax on the part of the Labour Party. But, you know, the problem with this is it's not stopped governments from advocating carbon tax. And usually they say, well, look, you know, we'll make the polluter pay, or the foreigner will pay, or big business will pay. You know, everybody knows, and everybody should know, that these people don't pay. In the end, it is the consumer/taxpayer who pays. But they sort of come at it in that particular way. The problem for us here is that although if you ask people they're going to pay $1,000 a year for this great new tax, they'll say no, they're already paying a lot of that. If in fact we start adding up what we're paying here in Australia, we're already getting, we're not 1,000, but we're already getting halfway there. We've got federal budgetary measures, which are clear, documented in the budget, it's $3 billion. We've got the renewable energy requirement by 2020. We can easily add up how much that requires. It's about $2 billion. Then we've got all these product standards, and the housing one alone is a colossal impost on people buying new houses that they wouldn't dare impose on existing houses. But you know, then that can come to $7 billion. In other words, even very conservatively, you could come to a level that we are paying at the present time about $10 billion in terms of greenhouse taxes and subsidies, which is about $500 per capita across everywhere in the country. And yet nobody knows this. Nobody points this out. And it's as though it's crept up, and I guess those who are promoting these policies want to keep on promoting them, secretly, if you like, or discreetly, and not publicising the fact that, you know, basically what we're going to do is really hammer you for this, and you'll be better off in the end, so vote for us. But it has crept up on us that we're already paying all this kind of money, about $10 billion a year, which amounts to $500 per head per capita. But of course, that's really only you know, one aspect of it. We're paying $500. Okay, that's bad enough. But the problem is that Australia and some other countries is very vulnerable. So perhaps the most vulnerable economy in the world to measures that make carbon emissions prohibitively expensive, because our coal and gas are so abundant and so cheap that we've got probably the world's lowest cost power sector. And if we reject this natural advantage, of course, we become considerably poorer. So that even if all countries were to apply a similar tax, as the Copenhagen Treaty envisages, Australia would still lose its competitive edge, since it's based on supplies of well-located coal, which would become far dearer in the nuclear energy, for example. And in addition, we would be paying, the households would be paying quite a lot more money in terms of their electricity bills. So risks for this, I mean, and risks where we start out with it, they cut two ways. There may well be a risk from climate change of a loss in GDP per capita, and that may well mean a few percent in the context of business as usual growth of over 2/3. There may well be that risk. But there's also a risk of severe economic consequences from forcing a radical restructuring of the economy and imposing costs to address the climate change. If we take early action that involves imposing costs, that's early action before anybody else, on the rosy assumption that rapid and low-cost adjustments will take place, and that these are misplaced, these assumptions, then we do condemn future generations to far lower levels of living standard. We are the nation with most to lose from acting expeditiously before everybody else in shutting down commercial energy production and replacing it with renewables, which is the strategy which Lopez is promoting. He said if we act first, we will gain the experience, we will do this and that. Well, I don't think it doesn't seem a credible action to me. If we act first, we will be closing down our activities before anybody else. Now, if the whole world were to move to a near eradication of carbon-based energy, then Australia, of course, would be forced to follow. But there is really no sign of this happening. The US, of course, has shaped a major emission reduction program. But if it changes, the US, the EU, China, India, all decide to do something, then, of course, so must Australia. But we have to put our own contribution in perspective. The key element of greenhouse emissions is energy, and the key element of that is electricity. The key element of that, of course, is coal-based electricity. Now, we've got about 30 gigawatts of coal-based electricity in Australia. Last year alone, China increased its coal-based electricity by 200 gigawatts, almost 7 times as much in 1 year. It may have been an exceptional year, but that's how much they increased it last year. 7 times as much as Australia. Now, you know, basically, taking a lead on this is quixotic, to say the least. Basically, it's saying, we'll take the lead, the rest of the world will follow, we'll gain the plaudits from that, and we'll be better off in the end. But really, we are the last nation to take the lead on it. We're the most vulnerable. We're a very, very small player, and those who say take the lead basically are an amalgamation of people who want totally different structure of the economy, want the money coming in from the tax or whatever to be funneled into worthy causes that they think causes they think are worthy, and are sort of have a feeling that we really ought to be running our economy quite as we are. And there are others, and you know, Mr. Rudd, I suppose, would be leading among those that somehow think that our lead by us will be the catalyst to bring others online, and we'll gain plaudits in the international community. But it doesn't seem a very credible position to me. Thanks.
Thank you, Alan, and I'm sure there are people in the audience